Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malday, Associate Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, BBC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal sits down with three demographics experts: Robert Warren with the Center for Migration Studies, Jeffrey Passel with the Pew Research Center, and Jennifer Van Hook with the Migration Policy Institute. They discuss methodologies used to estimate the unauthorized immigrant population, the recent trends in those estimates, and how they are used and understood or misunderstood in public policy debates. It's a deep dive into the data, so stay tuned.
The size and composition of the unauthorized immigrant population in the United States have long been central to policy discussions, shaping debates on border security, labor markets, and pathways to legal status. Recent years have seen heightened attention to this population, driven by record-high migrant encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border, shifting regional migration patterns, and ongoing political debates over immigration policy. Yet estimating the number of unauthorized immigrants in the United States at any given time is complex, and misconceptions often cloud public understanding. Speculative claims, like assertions that the population has grown by 10 million in just 3 years, fail to account for the nuances of migration trends, return migration, deportations, and legal status adjustments. Without a clear data-driven approach, misinformation can distort public perceptions and influence policy decisions in ways that may not align with reality. So to help us understand and examine this issue, we are joined by three expert guests who have been doing this work for a long time. First, Robert Warren is Senior Visiting Fellow at the Center for Migration Studies of New York. He previously served as a demographer for 34 years with the United States Census Bureau and the former Immigration and Naturalization Service, including as director of INS's Statistics Division from 1986 to 1995. So welcome to the podcast, Robert.
Thank you.
Next, Jeffrey Passel is Senior Demographer at the Pew Research Center, where he has authored numerous studies on immigrant populations in America. He formerly served as Principal Research Associate at the Urban Institute's Labor, Human Services, and Population Center. So welcome to the podcast, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
And finally, Jennifer Van Hook is Professor of Sociology and Demography and a Research Associate of the Population Research Institute at the Pennsylvania State University, where she conducts demographic research on the settlement and incorporation patterns of U.S. immigrants. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Migration Policy Institute and has previously held positions at the Urban Institute and Bowling Green State University. So welcome to the podcast, Jennifer.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we're going to get started with some basics. When conducting this research, how do each of you, for your purposes, define who is an unauthorized or undocumented immigrant? And Robert, let me start with you.
Okay, at CMS, we define undocumented immigrants as basically as people who, if encountered by a DHS official, could be removed from the country. That's kind of it. Just the standard definition of undocumented immigrant.
Jennifer, what about you? Do you have a different definition for your work?
Well, I mean, we really, at MPI and in my own work, I think of the undocumented or unauthorized population as kind of falling into three big bins. And so the first one would be people who come and cross into the country without inspection. So these are entries without inspection. And then there's a second group that may have come on a visa to begin with, a non-immigrant visa, and then overstayed it. And then finally, there's a growing group of people that have been referred to as having liminal status. And so they have some protections from deportation, but they're not durable. They could change with the change of an administration or a policy. And so this becomes, people in that category would include people with DACA, people with TPS, and then this growing group of people who are asylum seekers who haven't had their cases reviewed yet. There are other people in that category too, but those are the biggies.
Jeff, what about you?
We actually define the lawful resident population and the unauthorized then as everybody else. Mm-hmm. And I think this is something we actually all do, because we estimate the lawful population, and then the people who are left tend to be the unauthorized. Bob may do it differently, but the residual method sort of defines it that way. So The lawful population are people here on legal temporary visas that are long term. That's a smallest group. The largest group is people admitted with green cards, some of whom have become naturalized U.S. citizens, and then people admitted as refugees and asylees. That leaves a lot of people who are not deportable. These are the people Jennifer was just talking about. The people admitted under various kinds of Uniting for Ukraine, people given temporary protected status, those people aren't immediately deportable. So we define it kind of in the reverse way. And it's worth noting that not every country does it that way. For instance, people who are seeking asylum are considered by most European countries to be legal. But we look at it as people who are not here basically on a permanent basis or on a specific type of temporary visa.
So, from each of your perspectives, why is it important that we try to track this population? DHS offers us a lot of statistics on admissions, on legal immigrants, on border data. Why is it important that we try to understand how many people have this unauthorized or liminal status at any given time? Jennifer, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I was thinking about this in advance and thinking, there's a lot of different reasons people are interested in this information on both sides of the political spectrum. And, I don't know if I don't think I could go out on a limb and say, like they see the presence and growth of the unauthorized immigrant population to some degree as an indicator of a failure of U.S. immigration policy. And so on one hand, it's a failure of immigration enforcement and violation of the immigration law. Others see this population, though, as as sort of an indicator that the system that we've devised to select immigrants is not meeting the country's labor force needs. And so in that sense, it's a failure. And finally, when we think about immigration status and what it means for immigrants and their ability to eventually integrate into American society, again, this indicates a problem. So and I could elaborate on that more if you'd be interested. Yeah.
Well, Robert, let me ask you, because you've been doing this a long time, including when you were in government. Why did you start trying to track this? What was the impetus?
I joined the Census Bureau during the first Nixon administration. And one of my assigned duties was to see if we could figure out how many undocumented immigrants there were in the 1980 census. And actually, Jeff and I succeeded at that. And my other duties were to estimate how many were leaving the country and what the undercount was. So I had 3 impossible jobs. But that put aside, it's really important to track this because historically, the numbers of people coming across the border, the DHS statistics only report the number coming in. And it's really easy to exaggerate the numbers and how many are here. It's almost like if you were trying to figure out how many people were in a building, but you're only counting the ones coming in the door, and you fail to count the ones going out the door. And one of my jobs was to estimate immigration. And it turns out that about 1 million people leave the foreign-born population every year. And that is a statistic that is almost unknown.
Yeah. Jeff, what about you? What do you think is the most important reason to do this?
Well, I think I don't have a lot to add to all of this. And yes, I started doing this to try and estimate the undercount of the 1980 census. And but in terms of policy, it's these are people for the most part who are here for specifically to work, and they're here as part of the workforce, and they come here for jobs. And the fact that there are jobs for them, picking up on what Jennifer said, it represents a failure of the immigration system to provide the workers that are needed. And it's useful to know how many there are. I'm not sure that a lot of the discourse on this is grounded in the demographic reality, but it's worth knowing that, so you can say, wait a minute, 20 million people did not come into the country under Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a number that's wrong.
Yeah. So let's talk about the methodologies. Jeff, you mentioned this a little bit, the residual method. So we have a lot of listeners that may not be demographers, don't understand what this is all about. Let's start with, can you very simply explain how you come up with your estimate? Where do you start? What are your primary data sources? And how do you get to the estimate? And as simply as you can. I know that's hard.
Some level, it's a basic subtraction. We get information on how many immigrants are living in the country. That comes from surveys taken by the government, mainly the American Community Survey. It gives us an estimate of how many immigrants are in the country. We make adjustments because we know the survey doesn't include everybody, so we make some adjustment for that. And we have counts of the number of people who come in as legal immigrants. There are people admitted every year as refugees, people who acquire asylum status, and people who come in as lawful permanent residents. We count those every year, and then we can put that together with some demographic techniques by taking the number who were here last year, adding in the new people, taking account of how many die, taking account of how many leave the country. As Bob said, that's about 1 million a year. And we basically develop an estimate of the number of people living here with legal status because we have counts of those. And basically then we subtract the total number of immigrants, and we subtract from that the number of legal immigrants, and that gives us our estimate. And like I said, there's a lot more to it, and we recognize that the data are incomplete, so we have to make adjustments for that.
Yeah. So each of you in the work you've done maybe does this slightly differently. Robert, what might you do for your estimates for CMS that might be different than what Jeff is doing?
Actually, our estimates are computed totally differently from that.
Okay.
In the year 2010, we started with the very same residual kind of methodology, and we estimated the number here from every country. After that, for every year after that, up until even now 2023, we use a very different method. We take data directly from the American Community Survey for non-citizens who arrived after 1981. If they came in before, they'd be legalized. But it's all non-citizens who arrived after 1981. That's about 20 million people. Then we go in and we use actually data that was originated by Jeff. We use what we call logical edits. We take out all the people that we can identify as very likely being legal immigrants. Like, for example, if you're getting Medicare, or you have to prove there are a lot of categories that you have to prove your legal status. So that gets our 20 million down to about 12 million. Then we have one more step that's a little complicated, but we reduce that number for every country slightly more, and that gets us down to about 10 million or so. And then we make an adjustment of all of that for undercount, and we adjust for undercount, we adjust those who have come in more recently with higher levels of undercount. And basically, those are our estimates. We don't use any legal immigration data from DHS.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jennifer, what did you do differently maybe than Jeff or Robert?
Actually, we follow a methodology that's very close to what what Jeff Passel does. And so it's a residual methodology. Maybe some of our data sources or assumptions are a little different, but it's basically the same method. Yeah. I could point out a couple things. We might make different assumptions about coverage error, and we also make some assumptions that there's some misreporting on year of arrival. And so we smooth out some of those reports on year of arrival. But I'm guessing Jeff does very similar kinds of things as what we do.
Well, it is interesting in that, for each of you, you publish different estimates, although they're normally not very far apart. So, Robert, the most recent estimate from CMS was that there were 11.7 million undocumented immigrants as of July of 2023. Jeffrey, Pew estimates was 11 million as of 2022. Jennifer, the MPI estimate was 11.3 million as of mid 2022. What value do you feel there is in having multiple organizations do these estimates when they all come fairly close to each other? Robert, let me ask you that question first.
I think it's a good idea for for demographers to each look at this separately, because there's been kind of a history of these estimates being under attack by people who, I'm not sure how else to say it, make up numbers or use assumptions that are unreasonable. But I think one of the things that at CMS, we started doing this back in 2014 when legalization was on the table. And in 2014, the only numbers that we had available were the total U.S. population and the number in each state. And the idea, and I think we've all gone this direction, the idea was to try to get detailed information so we could list the characteristics of the population. So I think it's good for all of us to be looking at this and coming up with different numbers and just see how they agree and how they don't.
Yeah. Jennifer, do you look at others' estimates when you start doing your work, or do you kind of do your work and then see where it ends up?
It's mostly the latter, like we would do the work, see where we end up, and then we look and see
were we close? Did we get close to what other people have said?
Yeah, that's kind of how I work. So every year the new American Community Survey comes out in the fall, and I'll dive into the data, and it's usually right around my winter break after the end of the semester. And then by the end of it, I've come up with a new estimate, and then I'm send it around, and we'll compare after that. But
Jeff, what about you?
I think it's useful to have more people doing this, and if one of us or someone else starts producing numbers that are out of line, then it's probably worth looking at what's going on. But my sense is that, so I've been publishing numbers like this for a while. Bob published some when he was at INS and then DHS. Pew's been publishing these for 20 years almost, and we published some from the Urban Institute. When 25 years ago, there was a lot of disagreement about numbers, not among the people who really look at the data, but there were a lot of people, particularly in the more restrictionist, who were throwing around numbers that were much different and much bigger. Over time, there's been a convergence, I think, and the people who look seriously at data, whether they be restrictionist, pro-immigration, center, are using numbers that are all similar now. There's still a lot of rhetorical excess, but in terms of people who actually look at data, there's a broad acceptance that we're talking about numbers in the 11, 12, 13 million range now, and not 25 million and not 35 million. We can't stop politicians from throwing those things around. But I think there's been an acceptance of the basic facts about this, even from people who are adamantly opposed to current levels of immigration.
Yeah. So, Robert,
I would add, I'm sorry, could I add one more comment?
Absolutely.
It's good for different organizations to be doing this because some of us are getting a little older. We need new folks to take up
I don't know who you're talking about.
Mostly just myself.
Well, Robert, I want to ask you, because in addition to the work you did for CMS, you actually worked with the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Homeland Security Statistics on their most recent estimates of the unauthorized population. Can you talk about what you did for them and how that might differ from what you were doing with CMS?
Yeah, I worked half-time for them all last year, and my job there was to examine their estimates, look at their assumptions, and essentially make recommendations for how they could improve their estimates. And I left them with probably more recommendations than they'll be able to put into effect. it turns out their estimates are not very different from the ones we're talking about by country of origin and by state of residence. But the vast difference between their estimates and ours, all three of us, is that they don't have any data, any microdata. That is, they don't have details of other than just the number in each state and the number from each country and a few other summary statistics. So they do a very different, they do different estimates than we do, not nearly as in detail as all of us do.
And it's worth pointing out, I think, that they basically do a residual estimate, I believe. And some of us, me, Bob, I don't know about Jennifer, were telling them that some of the assumptions they were making in their estimates were not the best, and their estimates were kind of going awry a bit. And I think Bob's contribution there was to kind of straighten them out on some of those assumptions and clarify what they're doing. And now their estimates are I think more in line.
Yeah, I think that
I appreciate that, and I hope it's true.
well, just to be clear to our audience, the report that was issued in April 2024 from the Office of Homeland Security Statistics estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants as of January 2022. So when I was putting out those numbers, I noticed, as astute listeners will, that you're estimating not what's the population today, but what the population was at some point in the past. Can you talk to us a little bit about that sort of lag in the estimates and the data? Because what we hear in the political realm a lot is, well, we've seen X number of people arriving at the border since the last estimate that you all put out, and so it must be 15 million today or something like that. Let me start with you, Jeff. What's the reason that it's a little bit in arrears? I imagine it's the data sources you have.
Yes, we're basing our estimates on the American Community Survey, and there's a lag. And then it takes time to do the estimates. The most recent release of the detailed data from the American Community Survey was for 2023, and that's mid-2023. I believe Migration Policy Institute has released some estimates. We're working on ours. And so the reason a lot of us have estimates for 2022 is the most recent data we've had a chance to analyze is from the American Community Survey for 2022. There are some other data sources that are possible. The current population survey is a much smaller survey. It's the one the unemployment rate comes from every month, but it's a little harder to use because it's a much smaller sample, but it's more timely. And it, so there are ways to track the growth of the immigrant population since the most recent estimates we published, but it's harder to track the unauthorized.
Because you don't have that subtractable data to pull from it.
Right.
Yeah. So we're going to take a real quick break. And when we get back, we're going to dive into some other people that have put out numbers recently and get your thoughts on that. So stay tuned. Welcome back. So let me ask you about some other folks that have put out some numbers recently. Both the Congressional Budget Office and the Census Bureau have remarked on the major increase in the foreign-born population over the last few years, largely stemming from border arrivals. Now, they're estimating the total foreign-born population. Neither organization is trying to estimate the unauthorized. But how do or have these recently arrived immigrants factor into each of your estimates of the unauthorized population? And let me start with you, Jeff.
Yes, well, the surveys we're using predate, the Census Bureau has revised the way they measure the population, and their most recent population estimates added a lot of people to it, to the population, specifically added immigrants. So what we're doing is we're going back and redoing our 2022 estimate because the Census Bureau basically added about 600,000 or 700,000 immigrants, almost all of whom are unauthorized. So we'll be issuing a revised number that takes that into account. Similarly, with 2022, the Census Bureau added almost 2 million immigrants to the population that their additional immigrants are not represented in the survey data we have. And so we've been working on ways to incorporate that. And the net outcome of this is basically the unauthorized immigrant population estimates that we'll be releasing for 2023 are probably about 2 million, going to be about 2 million higher than they would have been had the Census Bureau not released this.
Yeah. Jennifer, what about you? Did your most recent MPI estimates take this into account?
Yeah, we came at it with a little different methodology than what Jeff described, but I think we're going to end up in the same ballpark. What we did is we started looking at other sources of data that give indicators of sort of the size or the footprint of the foreign-born population, and use that as a way of estimating change in the extent to which the population of foreign-born is represented in the American Community Survey. And so, for example, we use data on births to foreign-born mothers in the vital statistics system and compared that with the numbers of similar mothers in the American Community Survey from the same countries and found a pretty markedly increase in the number of such parents missed in the American Community Survey over the last couple of years. And so we took that into account to make additional adjustments for coverage starting in about 2021. And so we backdated some of our previous estimates and revised those. And it increased about, so now we're at, for our 2023 numbers, we're at about 13.7 million, which again is about 2 million higher than where we might have been without that adjustment.
Robert, what about you? Are you looking at these latest revisions from the census, and what do you think it's going to mean?
Yeah, we have. Well, I spent about a month before I actually got any data analyzing everybody else's reports. I didn't have the ones from MPI because they just came out a week or two ago. But in our analysis, one of the things that I'm firmly convinced about is that you hear people talk about the Census Bureau having more and more undercount in the ACS over the last few years. And if you analyze entry cohorts over the last 10 years, you find that there really is there's no additional undercount in 2022 or 2023 in the population that's been here before 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So the longer term residents are still being counted about the same rates.
Okay. Those graphs just slightly decline as they should. So I see no evidence that there's additional undercount for people who arrived before 2020. Okay. And there probably is large undercount in the ACS in 2022 and 2023 for arrivals. Mm-hmm. It's the arrivals that they're having difficulty counting, not the ones who lived here 2 or 3 years ago. In our estimates, we make a pretty hefty adjustment for arrivals, those who arrived in 2021, 2, and 3. Instead of about a 15% adjustment for undercount, we use rates that are about 3 times the level that the Census Bureau has reported for the ACS.
Oh, wow.
So we use, for arrivals in 21, 2, and 3, we adjust the numbers by about just over 40%. And so that altogether in 2023, we haven't published our numbers yet, but I'll give you a preview. We add about 1.6 million for undercount in 2023, a total. And our estimates come up to about 12.2 million. And as we explain in our paper forthcoming, one of the reasons that we're lower than other people is that our estimates don't include most of the asylum seekers.
Ah, okay.
Oh.
They include some, but not most.
Got it. Jeff, you had some thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's interesting. The other data source I mentioned, the current population survey, which again, like I said, is a smaller survey, does seem to be picking up these new arrivals. The foreign-born population numbers from the current population survey are a lot higher than what comes from the American Community Survey. And this is a departure from what was going on in the teens and the aughts, where the numbers were very much in line. My own theory is that the current population survey interviews are done in person, whereas the American Community Survey is done mostly by mail. And so in a situation where there's a large number of people who've come into the country over the last several years, current population survey actually seems to be picking these people up.
Yeah. So Robert, this is interesting that we're talking about the last few years and the large number of people arriving at the border. But years ago, you did a lot of research saying at that time, lots and lots of people in the unauthorized populations were people who had come in and overstayed. How have you seen that sort of trajectory in the unauthorized population between sort of overstayers, illegal entrants, and now this new crop of people who are many of them asylum seekers or these other liminal statuses?
Well, up until about 2019 or 2020, well, for the previous decade, from 2010 to 2020, 2 out of every 3 unauthorized immigrants arriving here arrived by air. So 2 out of 3 arriving in that decade were arriving and overstaying temporary visas. We had a preview of this question, and so one of the things I did was to go back and look at a paper that Jeff and I did back in a long time ago. Estimates of the number of undocumented immigrants counted in the 1980 census.
Wow.
And so I was able to go through there and estimate what percentage were overstays in 1980 census. And I think this will surprise you, Jeff, 40%.
Mm-hmm.
So 40% were overstays. And the percentage of overstays over the last times we've measured, we haven't really measured since 2020 because of data problems. It's been about 45 or 46%. So it looks like that's been fairly stable over the last 40 years.
One of the big differences of what's happening recently is that the border enforcement has changed in the last 3 years, and because of the people applying for asylum. And so, there have always been a large number of encounters at the border, but until about 3 or 4 years ago, almost all of them were sent back. What changed beginning in about 2021 was the Border Patrol and the Office of Field Operations started releasing people into the country. So there used to be a kind of disconnect between encounters at the border and growth of the unauthorized immigrant population, because the encounters at the border were people who were caught and returned. But beginning in 2021, there were a significant number of people who were released into the country and who don't show up in the American Community Survey for a couple of years.
Yeah. Jennifer, let me ask you a follow-up to that, because so looking now, and this is a lot of conversation about this in the public policy discourse around this right now, should we be making a more direct connection today between border encounters and increases in the undocumented population than maybe we might have in the past, based on what Jeff said and your work now?
That's a good question. So, I think I would say caution, right? Before you start just adding in the numbers of new arrivals, but based on the DHS border encounter data, because there's not a one-to-one.
Well, they also changed the policy.
Right. Yeah.
They changed the policy in mid-2024 and stopped releasing people and started sending them back.
Exactly. And even during that time, though, there was not a one-to-one correspondence, because just because there was somebody who was let in and released into the interior, it doesn't account for the fact that at the same time, there was a lot of undocumented immigrants that arrived 20, 30 years ago who are now getting older. They're dying, they're legalizing, they're returning to their countries of origin. And so there's a counterflow that's happening all along the whole time, and so we need to account for all of that when we think about growth in this population. And so there's not a one-to-one correspondence.
Well, Jeff, I want to come back to you, because Pew has been documenting for a long time, a decline in the Mexican unauthorized population, which is still the largest single nationality, if I recall, where more Mexicans, net negative migration from Mexico. And then we saw growth in Central American and Asian immigration over time. Are we still seeing that in the most recent encounters or estimates data, or is
Yes. The if you look at the releases from the border at the border, only a very small percentage of them are Mexicans. The Mexican population is aging itself. Uh, there's been economic growth in Mexico. There's been institutional safeguards put in Mexico. So Doug Massey used to say that migration to the U.S. was an insurance policy against issues occurring in Mexico, and family sizes in Mexico have gone down. The institutions have matured. So there's not the push factor and the population excess population in Mexico driving this anymore. And the if you look at the number of Mexicans, not without regard to legal status, that population has hardly changed in the last 15 years. The number of Mexican born immigrants in the US has hardly changed. But, Central America is a different question, and lately South America as well. And so the nature of the population has undergone a significant shift over the last 15 or 20 years.
Mhm. I want to ask each of you a final question before we finish up here. For each of you, what is sort of the one biggest, maybe misrepresentation or misapprehension about your work that you see or hear in the public discourse? Misunderstanding how you do your work, misunderstanding how to read the numbers, that you would like the opportunity to correct. And Robert, let me start with you.
Okay, I actually had a little time to think about this, and and I've actually mentioned it before, and I've been writing reports on this for 40 years. There seems to be a general consensus that everybody wants to come here and no one ever leaves. And this has to do with emigration from the United States. And I actually published a report back in 1985 on that. But I want to give you an example, and I have to use a few numbers here, so stay with me. So the 2010 ACS counted 40 million foreign born. Okay, 40 million in 2010. For the next 13 years, we admitted 14 million immigrants. The student and temporary worker population went up by about a million. And according to many estimates, we had about 6 million undocumented immigrants. So that's 21 million arrivals after 2010. So that you think, well, is the population 61 million? But the population counted in 2023 was 48 million. So that means 13 million people, foreign born, either died or left the country. And that comes to about a million a year. It turns out about maybe a quarter of those died, but they left. So the point is, people do move out of the country, and that needs to be taken into account in our immigration policy.
Jeff, what is the one sort of biggest misapprehension or misconception you would like
to? I think it's not necessarily a misapprehension or misconception of my own work. It's a misconception of the unauthorized immigrant population, and that is that basically it's a population of young working families, and it's not. The stereotype is, a single guy from Mexico or somebody even worse bringing in drugs or something. But if you look at the data, by and large, it's young families and working families. And increasingly, I think Jennifer said, there are people who've been here now for 20, 25 years or longer who are still in a either quasi-legal or completely unauthorized status, and but who have developed lives here. And I think the notion that the unauthorized immigrant population is somehow isolated and other is a complete misapprehension of the actual reality of this population. They are young working families with children in school for the most part.
Jennifer, what about you?
Yeah, Jeff, you took my point away.
Great minds think alike,
Yeah, I know. I was going to make the point about embeddedness in American society, but there's another point that somebody came to me and said, "Why don't you use the word illegal alien? Because all these people came here illegally, right?" And I said, "Whoa, that's not true. The undocumented or the unauthorized population, actually, there's a lot of people in that population who have these quasi-legal statuses now, and that share of the population is growing in size. And so, yes, there are some people who cross the border without inspection, but then there's also a whole lot of people who came here legally to begin with, or have some kind of basis for their residence in the United States. And so, even though their status may not be durable, in the current political climate, there was a reason for why they're here, and there was some authorization to their work and to their lives in the United States. And so I think that feeds into sort of there's just a growing amount of heterogeneity in this population. Many of them have greater claims to their life in the United States than might be portrayed in the media.
There's a relatively small group, it's 500,000 people roughly, who were actually vetted, have sponsors, and were admitted to the United States, who we all consider part of the unauthorized immigrant population. This is people from Ukraine who came under a program called Uniting for Ukraine, people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, who were cleared and have come in. And they, at one point I argued we should just call them legal immigrants, but they're now apparently going to be subject to deportation, even though they went through processes at least as detailed as people admitted legally.
Well, that was a very deep dive into this important area of statistical estimates by three estimable people. So you can find all of their work online. Jennifer Van Hook's work with the Migration Policy Institute is at migrationpolicy.org. Robert Warren's work with the Center for Migration Studies is at cmsny.org. And Jeff Passel is at Pew Research Center at pewresearch.org, if I'm correct.
It's PEW,
yes, pewresearch.org. And you can find all of their work and the deep dive if you really want to know how they did their work. They all show their work, people. It is there in their methodology sections. You can go find out. But thank you very much again for joining us on This Week in Immigration.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. Stay tuned for our next episode in 2 weeks. In the meantime, one last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malday. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malday. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself, Theresa Cardinal Brown, and Diana Wang. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.